What happens when a ruthless gang targets the wrong black business owner, thinking his quiet demeanor makes him an easy mark? What happens when they find out that he is an ex-Special Forces operative? Watch as Caleb, the seemingly ordinary store owner, fights back against the gang and uncovers a shocking secret that has contributed to the deliberate targeting of black communities. The late afternoon sun bathed the quiet streets of Armitage, a small neighborhood on the edge of the city. The area had once been thriving, but now, like many places on the fringes, it had fallen victim to neglect and gentrification. Yet there was still a pulse here, a quiet resilience that ran through the cracks in the pavement and the faded storefronts. Caleb Turner stood behind the counter of his corner shop, Turner's Market, located at the intersection of 5th and Maple. The shelves were neatly stocked with essentials, canned goods, snacks, and fresh produce that served the tight-knit community. The store had been a staple in the neighborhood for over 2 decades, and Caleb was more than just the owner. He was a guardian of sorts. It wasn't just about selling groceries. It was about providing a sense of security, of familiarity in a world that seemed to be changing faster than anyone could keep up with. Caleb's military background was well behind him now, but the skills and instincts he had honed as a Special Forces operative never left him. Every corner of the store was meticulously organized. The goods were carefully placed, the locks reinforced, and the alarm system wired into every vulnerable corner. For Caleb, this wasn't just a store, it was a lifeline for the people who lived here. As Caleb adjusted the security camera monitor on the counter, his sharp eyes scanned the feed out of habit. It wasn't paranoia. He had learned long ago to trust his instincts. He wasn't just watching customers. He was preparing for whatever might come his way. He saw an older man walk past the window, shuffling with a cane, and a young mother chase after her toddler who was darting around on the sidewalk. Caleb couldn't help but smile. It was the rhythm of his life, a quiet reminder of why he stayed, even when everything outside the neighborhood seemed to be encroaching on what they had built here. The bell above the door chimed, pulling him from his thoughts. A regular customer, Mr. Harris, walked in, nodding in greeting before heading to the back to grab a carton of milk. Caleb offered a quick smile but found his mind wandering again. Recently, he had heard whispers, rumors of small businesses like his being pressured into selling their properties to developers, threats of violence lurking in the shadows. He hadn't seen anything firsthand, but the tension was palpable. Caleb locked the front door for a moment, counting the cash in the register. The store was quiet, but something about the silence seemed to carry weight. The neighborhood was changing, and Caleb could feel it. He had always been the kind of person to fight for what he believed in, but even he knew that this fight might be bigger than just him. It was when he reopened the door that the storm arrived. A weathered pickup truck rolled slowly up to the curb, its engine rumbling like thunder. Caleb glanced at the security monitor, spotting 3 men climbing out of the truck. They weren't just any customers. Caleb's trained eyes took in their swagger, their glances, their posture. This was trouble. The leader, a stocky man with a hard edge named Jack, stepped forward, his eyes scanning the shelves with a smirk. The other 2 followed, each carrying the same menacing energy. Caleb's hand instinctively hovered near the counter. He wasn't just watching customers anymore. He was preparing himself for what was coming. "Nice place you've got here," Jack said, his voice dripping with mock praise. He tapped the counter with his fingers. "Seems like you're doing pretty well for yourself." Caleb didn't respond right away. He let the words hang in the air, his gaze calm but unyielding. "We get by," Caleb replied, his voice even. There was no fear, no hesitation, just the calm certainty of someone who had been through far worse. The other man, Tom, wandered down an aisle, his heavy boots echoing on the floor. He picked up a box of cereal, turned it over in his hands and tossed it back onto the shelf with a loud thud. "Bet you could do even better," he muttered, his voice carrying. "You know, with the right kind of help." Caleb kept his eyes on Jack, but his senses were sharp. He could feel the situation escalating. "We don't need any help," he said, his tone flat and final. Jack laughed, a short, mocking sound. "That's the thing about people like you," he said, leaning in closer. "Always so proud. Think you can do it all by yourself. But let me tell you something. Pride is expensive, and from where I'm standing, it looks like you can't afford it." Caleb's expression didn't change. He wasn't going to rise to the bait. He wasn't going to let these men rattle him. "Is that so?" he replied, his voice low but unwavering. The third man, a lanky individual named Mike, stood near the door, a nervous chuckle escaping his lips. "Man, Jack, this guy's got balls. Standing here all calm like we're just here for a snack or something." Jack shot Mike a sharp look that shut him up immediately. He leaned in even closer, lowering his voice. "We're not asking for much," Jack said. "Just a little cut, a small fee to make sure nothing happens to this nice little shop of yours." Caleb's eyes remained locked on Jack, but his hand tightened on the edge of the counter. "Nothing's going to happen to my store," he said firmly. Jack's smirk faltered for a brief moment, but he quickly recovered, throwing his head back in a loud laugh. "You hear that, boys? He thinks he's untouchable." He motioned to Tom, who had gotten closer to the register. "Why don't you show him what happens to guys who don't want to play ball?" Tom grabbed a jar of sauce off the shelf and held it up, pretending to examine it. "This stuff's expensive," he said with exaggerated curiosity. "Think it'll break if I drop it?" Caleb's fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to stay composed. "You can leave now," he said in a voice that was calm, but laden with unspoken authority. Jack raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Leave? We just got here, and besides, we're not done talking yet." Tom's grin widened. "Yeah, you're gonna clean that up," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Caleb's eyes locked on the broken jar of sauce that now lay scattered across the floor. The deep red sauce splattered across the tiles, a clear symbol of the escalating tension. Caleb stood there for a moment, his gaze unwavering. "Pick it up," he said, his voice sharp, cutting through the tension like a knife. Tom laughed and took a step forward, clearly not intimidated. "I don't think so, old man," he sneered. "But you can clean it up, right? Isn't that what you're here for?" Caleb's eyes remained steady, his resolve unshaken. This wasn't how things worked here. "You're leaving," he said, his voice low and deadly calm. "Now." The day had barely started when Caleb arrived at the store, his routine precise as always. He unlocked the door, checked the security cameras, and ensured everything was in place. His movements were deliberate, each step measured, habit honed from years of military training. He knew this neighborhood well, and his instincts told him that something wasn't right. It had been a quiet morning so far, with only a few regulars coming in for their daily needs. But Caleb was alert. He could feel it in his bones, the calm before the storm. As he adjusted the monitor showing the security cameras, Caleb's mind wandered back to the encounter with Jack and his crew yesterday. He had warned them, told them that they made a mistake. He had hoped they'd leave it at that, but men like them rarely walked away without getting what they wanted, and the sense of unease gnawing at Caleb only deepened. He had been through worse, but his sense of responsibility for the people in this neighborhood, his community, was what truly weighed on him. He double-checked the store's alarm system one more time, making sure that the silent alarm was activated. It had become a habit, a small but essential precaution that ensured Caleb could call for help without alerting anyone who meant him harm. As he went about his business, his thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a truck rumbling down the street. Caleb instinctively glanced toward the window. His eyes narrowed when he saw the same battered blue pickup truck from yesterday pulling up to the curb. It was them. Jack and his crew were back. Caleb stood behind the counter, his muscles coiled like a spring. He knew the routine by now: pretend to be casual, keep the tension just under the surface. But this time, something had changed. He didn't have to pretend anymore. This wasn't about intimidation or threats. Caleb knew what they were here for, and he wasn't going to let them take it from him. The bell above the door chimed as the three men stepped inside. Jack entered first, his confident swagger unmistakable. His eyes immediately scanned the room, sizing up Caleb before focusing on the shelves. Tom, the stocky one, was already poking around, looking for something to toss onto the floor. Mike, the lanky man, hung back by the door, a nervous energy radiating off him. "Back so soon?" Caleb asked, his tone steady, his eyes locked on Jack. He didn't flinch. Jack smiled, his grin tight and full of malice. "Miss us, Caleb? Thought you might have reconsidered after our last conversation." His voice carried that same condescending edge from yesterday. "We're not done here," Tom added, his voice low as he picked up another item off the shelf and examined it as if it were his to take. He tossed it back onto the shelf with a thud. "I think it's time you thought about what we're offering, yeah?" "I told you already," Caleb said, keeping his voice calm and unbroken. "I'm not interested, and neither is this store." "Funny," Jack replied with a raised eyebrow. "Because it sure sounds like you need a little help, Caleb. This place, your whole operation, it's on the verge of falling apart. A little fee, just a little cut, and we'll make sure it all stays smooth sailing. You wouldn't want something bad to happen, would you?" Caleb's mind raced. He knew exactly what this was about. It wasn't just about his store, it was about control. Jack and his crew weren't just extorting him, they were part of a bigger game. A game Caleb had seen before, one that involved pushing out small business owners like him for profit. He wasn't going to play along. He couldn't. "I'm not selling," Caleb said, his voice unwavering. "Not today. Not ever." Jack's eyes narrowed, a flicker of frustration crossing his face. He had expected a different reaction, something weaker. "You're really stubborn, huh?" Jack muttered, leaning in closer. "You're going to regret this." Without warning, Tom surged forward, grabbed a jar of sauce off the shelf, and threw it against the wall. The glass shattered with a loud crack, red sauce splattering across the floor. The noise echoed through the store, a symbol of the violence they were willing to bring. Caleb didn't flinch. His eyes stayed locked on Jack, even as the mess on the floor grew. "Clean it up," Caleb said calmly. Tom chuckled, clearly enjoying the chaos. "Yeah, right," he sneered. "You want me to clean it up? Do it yourself, old man." Caleb's fists clenched at his sides, but he stayed composed. The situation was escalating, but he knew he couldn't let them see his emotions. He needed to stay in control. "Leave now," Caleb's voice cut through the tension, "before things get worse." Jack's smirk returned, though this time it was tinged with annoyance. "You really think you have a say in this?" he sneered, turning to Mike, who was standing near the door. "Go ahead, Mike. Show him what happens to people who don't play ball." Mike took a step forward, cracking his knuckles, and Caleb could see the glint of something dangerous in his eyes. Caleb's body tensed, every muscle prepared for what was coming next. He had to act fast. "Enough," Caleb said, his voice low, steady. The weight of his words settled between them like a challenge. Jack raised an eyebrow. "What's that? You think you're going to stop us? We're just getting started here." His voice dropped lower, and for a moment, Caleb could see the menace in his eyes. "And when we come back, we're not going to ask nicely. You'll wish you'd sold." Caleb took a deep breath. His mind was already working, already calculating the next steps. This wasn't just about surviving this encounter. It was about making sure it didn't happen again. "You've made a mistake," Caleb said, his tone deadly calm. "If you come back, it'll be the last mistake you make." For a moment, Jack hesitated. It was clear that he didn't expect Caleb to fight back this way. He looked at his men, who seemed to weigh the situation, but then Jack gave a small, mocking chuckle. "We'll see about that, old man," he said, motioning for Tom and Mike to leave. Caleb didn't move. He stood there watching as they turned and walked out, their footsteps heavy as they made their way toward the door. The bell above the door chimed once more as they left, but Caleb didn't feel any relief. He knew this wasn't over. As the door shut behind them, Caleb allowed himself a deep breath. It wasn't over yet, but he would be ready. He had already begun preparing for the storm that was coming. The next morning, Caleb was already up before dawn, as usual. The stillness of the early hours was comforting, and he used the time to prepare. His routine was the same as always. Unlock the door, check the security systems, restock the shelves, and get the cash register ready. But today there was a different weight in the air. The tension from the previous day's confrontation lingered, and Caleb knew he couldn't let his guard down, not even for a moment. He leaned over the counter, scanning the security monitor. There were no signs of movement on the streets yet, but he knew better than to trust the quiet. The events of yesterday had shown him that Jack and his crew would return, and it was only a matter of when. Caleb had spent the night thinking about how to handle things if they came back, and he was ready for them. As the sun started to rise, a few early customers trickled in, buying their coffee or breakfast items. Caleb kept an eye on the door, staying alert while maintaining the calm, neutral expression he had perfected over the years. He knew this neighborhood well. He knew the regulars by name, their routines, and what they needed before they even asked. But today, all of that felt secondary. Caleb's focus was on the threat that was closing in. The bell above the door jingled again, and Caleb looked up, his hand instinctively hovering near the counter. He recognized the familiar rumble of the same old pickup truck that had pulled up the day before. This time, however, the truck wasn't alone. Caleb saw the shadows of Jack, Tom, and Mike stepping out of the vehicle, and his stomach tightened. He had expected this, but the reality of it still hit hard. They were back. The trio walked toward the store, their heavy boots echoing against the pavement. Jack led the way, a smug grin on his face, while Tom and Mike followed. This time, there was no pretense of politeness. They were here to make a statement. As the door swung open, Jack stepped inside first, giving Caleb a sharp look. "I thought about what you said last time," Jack began, his voice cool, almost casual. "But I think you've made a mistake, Caleb. You don't get to refuse an offer like this, not without consequences." Caleb stood motionless behind the counter, his gaze unbroken. "I don't make mistakes," he replied, his tone firm and unwavering. Tom wandered down an aisle, his boots scraping against the floor as he scanned the shelves with disinterest, occasionally tossing a box onto the floor just for the sake of making a mess. Mike stayed by the door, his nervous energy apparent, but still dangerous. "You don't get it, do you?" Jack continued, leaning against the counter. His eyes narrowed as he studied Caleb, sizing him up. "This isn't just about your store. It's about your entire neighborhood. You've got something we want, and if you don't give it up willingly, we'll make you." Caleb's fists clenched at his sides, but he didn't let his emotions show. He knew exactly what Jack was talking about. This wasn't about extorting money or intimidating him into selling. This was part of a bigger operation, one that was targeting not just his business, but the entire community. "We're not going to play that game," Caleb said, his voice steady, but the words felt heavier than he wanted them to. "You can't push us around," Jack scoffed, standing up straight. "That's where you're wrong. You're outnumbered. You can't fight back forever." Suddenly, Tom stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with malice. He picked up a jar of pickles from the shelf, holding it up to Caleb. "What do you think, Caleb?" Tom taunted. "You want to make this easy, or should we start breaking things? Maybe knock over a few more shelves?" Caleb's gaze remained locked on Jack, his mind calculating, his body poised for action. The situation was escalating quickly, but he wasn't going to back down. Not this time. He had made his stand, and he would defend what was his, what belonged to the people in this community. "Leave," Caleb said, his voice low and dangerous. "Now!" Jack's face hardened, the smirk fading from his lips. He motioned to Tom, who immediately hurled the jar of pickles onto the floor. The glass shattered, the contents spilling out in a messy splash of vinegar and brine. Caleb didn't flinch. His eyes didn't leave Jack's, even as the noise reverberated through the store. "You're going to clean that up, old man," Tom said, his voice dripping with disdain. "I told you," Caleb replied. "You're leaving." "Now." Tom stepped forward again, his posture aggressive. But before he could make another move, Caleb's hand shot out from behind the counter. His fingers closed around the base of a heavy can of soup, and with a swift motion, he sent it crashing into Tom's chest. Tom staggered back in surprise, his hands instinctively going to his chest as he looked at Caleb, shocked by the force of the action. Jack's eyes flared with fury. "You want to do this the hard way?" he spat. Caleb took a step forward, his eyes unwavering. "You already made your choice." The air between them crackled with tension. Jack's fists clenched, his patience running out. "Let's show him who's in charge here," Jack said, nodding toward Mike. Mike hesitated for a moment, clearly unsure about the escalation, but then he moved toward Caleb with a quick, calculated step. The tension in the room grew thick. Caleb knew what was coming next, but he was ready. With a swift, controlled motion, Caleb stepped aside as Mike lunged at him, using his own momentum to sidestep and send Mike crashing into a shelf. The clatter of cans spilling across the floor was drowned out by Mike's yelp of pain. As Mike scrambled to his feet, Caleb wasn't done. He kicked out, sending Mike flying into a nearby rack of snacks. It was over in seconds. Tom groaned from where he had landed on the floor, clutching his chest. Mike was scrambling, dazed from the impact. Caleb didn't move, his eyes focused on Jack, who now stood alone, his bravado crumbling. "You're done here," Caleb said, his voice sharp and final. He wasn't out of breath, but the quiet intensity of the moment felt like an electric charge. For a moment, Jack seemed to consider pressing on, but then he glanced at his men, who were clearly out of their depth. With a low growl, he motioned toward the door. "This isn't over," Jack spat before backing away. "We'll be back, Caleb, and next time, we'll finish this." Caleb didn't move. He just stood there, his posture unyielding. "If you come back, it'll be your last mistake." With that, Jack and his crew turned, leaving the store in silence. The bell above the door jingled softly as they exited, and Caleb allowed himself a brief moment to breathe. It wasn't over, he knew, but this was just one battle. As the door clicked shut behind them, Caleb's hand hovered over the security monitor, confirming that the cameras had captured everything. They were coming back. He knew that much. But Caleb was ready. He had fought for his community before, and he would do it again. The morning after the second confrontation, Caleb was already moving with a heightened sense of urgency. His store was still in disarray. Shelves overturned, broken glass scattered across the floor, and the lingering smell of pickles and sauce in the air. But he knew he couldn't waste time cleaning up. He had more pressing matters to deal with. His instincts told him that Jack and his crew wouldn't be gone for long. They were relentless, and Caleb knew they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. Caleb was no stranger to pressure, to living in the shadows of danger. He had seen far worse in his days in the Special Forces. He'd survived countless missions, some of which had nearly cost him his life. But this wasn't just about survival. It was about protecting everything he had worked for: his community, his business, and the people who depended on him. As the store opened for business, Caleb worked with a sense of purpose. But every movement, every task was calculated. His eyes kept flicking back to the security cameras, scanning for any sign of danger. The front door, now reinforced with a heavy lock, had a set of surveillance monitors that Caleb kept in the corner of his eye at all times. His every move was an exercise in vigilance. By noon, the store was starting to fill with customers again. Caleb greeted them with his usual calm demeanor, but there was an underlying tension. He had been in the military long enough to know that nothing was random. Every glance, every whispered conversation could be a sign that someone was watching, waiting for an opening. His mind raced as he worked. The previous day's confrontation had only confirmed what Caleb suspected. Jack and his crew were just pawns in a much larger operation. Their intimidation tactics, their veiled threats, they weren't just about extorting him for money. They were part of a well-oiled machine, a network that was targeting small businesses in the area. The more Caleb thought about it, the more it became clear. The root of the problem wasn't just Jack. It was the bigger players behind him. The development company, Vincent Harrington's company, was at the heart of it all. Caleb had heard of Harrington before. He was a well-known name in real estate, a developer who had a reputation for pushing out small, minority-owned businesses in order to gentrify neighborhoods. This wasn't just a few bad apples. It was a full-blown operation to strip away everything that made neighborhoods like Armitage thrive. Caleb had to act. He couldn't let them take over this community, not without a fight. That night, after the store had closed, Caleb locked the door and went into the back room. The back office was small, but it was secure. It held the tools Caleb had hoped he would never need again: a tactical flashlight, a collapsible baton, a pair of gloves, and most importantly, a small, portable hard drive that held everything he had learned about Harrington and his operation. He had spent hours poring over the security footage, looking for any clues that might tie Harrington directly to the people who were trying to take down his neighborhood. What he had found shocked him. The footage from the last confrontation wasn't just a record of violence. It was a glimpse into the organized chaos that Harrington had set into motion. The more Caleb dug, the more it became clear that the gang members were acting on Harrington's orders. And worse, they weren't just trying to intimidate him. They were systematically targeting other small business owners in the area, using threats, vandalism, and even violence to drive them out. Caleb had a plan now. It was risky, but it was the only way to get to the heart of the operation. He knew the gang would return. He was certain of it. So he needed to be ready. This time, he wouldn't wait for them to make the first move. He would take control of the situation. The first step was gathering more information on Harrington's ties to the operation. Caleb had contacted an old army buddy, Marcus, who now worked in cybersecurity. Marcus was the best when it came to digging through public records and finding hidden connections. Caleb wasn't going to rely on just his own findings. He needed professional help. The next morning, Marcus called Caleb with an update. He had run the partial license plate from the pickup truck and dug into Harrington's real estate transactions. What he found was both startling and incriminating. The truck was registered to a man named Todd Andrews, a known associate of Harrington's, with a long rap sheet that included breaking and entering, aggravated assault, and minor drug charges. But it wasn't just Todd Andrews. Caleb found that several properties in the neighborhood had been sold under suspicious circumstances, all of them connected to Harrington's company. The connections were growing clearer by the minute, and Caleb had a sinking feeling in his stomach. He needed to confront them. No more waiting. He couldn't allow them to destroy everything his community had built. But Caleb knew this wasn't something he could handle alone. He needed help, and not just from his old army buddy. He needed to bring the police in on this, but he had to do it carefully. If he pushed too hard, too fast, the whole operation could unravel, and Harrington's people would go to ground. That afternoon, Caleb met with Detective Rachel Brooks. He had worked with her on a few cases in the past, and he trusted her instincts. But this was different. This wasn't just about a few vandals. It was about a large-scale operation, a coordinated effort to displace entire neighborhoods for profit. Caleb didn't know how far this went, but he knew it had to stop. Rachel listened intently as Caleb explained the situation. She was sharp, and she could see the bigger picture unfolding before her. "We've got to move fast," she said, her voice steady. "We can't afford to let them get comfortable. If they think they're untouchable, they'll come back harder." Caleb nodded. He wasn't worried about the gang coming back. He knew they would. What worried him was how deep the corruption went, how many people were involved, and how could he prove it without putting the whole neighborhood in even more danger. "We'll gather everything we can," Rachel said, giving him a reassuring look. "We'll get a warrant, gather the evidence, and put the pressure on. We've got enough to go after the small-time players, but to get Harrington, we need something more, and we'll need your help to make sure they don't slip away." Caleb wasn't backing down. He had already put everything on the line for this community, and now, with the help of people he trusted, he was going to take the fight to the real enemy. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Caleb spent his time alternating between managing the store and working with Detective Rachel Brooks. His mind was constantly racing, trying to piece together the web of corruption that had woven itself into the very fabric of Armitage. The more he uncovered, the darker the picture became. This wasn't just about one gang or one corrupt developer. It was about a systematic effort to displace entire communities in the name of profit. Caleb knew that Jack and his crew were just pawns in a much bigger game. Their violence was a tool, a means to an end. The real mastermind behind the operation, Vincent Harrington, was far more dangerous. He was the one pulling the strings, orchestrating the intimidation, the vandalism, and the threats. Harrington had made a name for himself in real estate by buying up properties at rock-bottom prices, and he didn't care who or what he had to destroy to get them. But Caleb wasn't just going to sit back and let him win. He knew that if they were going to take down Harrington, they needed more than just a few low-level thugs. They needed concrete evidence, something that would tie Harrington directly to the criminal activities that were ravaging the neighborhood. Rachel had been working overtime, digging through public records and trying to find anything that would link Harrington to the violence. But it wasn't easy. Harrington had layered his operations behind shell companies, using third-party fronts to conceal his involvement. It was a masterful strategy, but Rachel wasn't deterred. Caleb's intel, coupled with her resources, was starting to bring things into focus. One evening, Caleb sat at the small table in his office, his mind going over the information he had gathered. He was staring at the stack of papers in front of him, public records, transactions, property sales, and a list of names that kept popping up over and over again. One name stood out more than the others: Michael Harrington, Vincent's brother, who appeared to be the one coordinating some of the more violent tactics. Caleb had heard whispers about Michael before, but nothing solid until now. The more Caleb thought about it, the clearer it became. Michael Harrington was just as involved in the intimidation tactics as his brother. In fact, Caleb suspected that Michael had been using his connections to keep the police and local officials at bay. But Caleb had learned enough in his years as an operative to know that no operation was foolproof. There were always cracks, always weak links, and that's where he planned to strike. The next step was to gather more evidence. Caleb knew that if he could tie Michael to the violence in the area, it would put enough pressure on Vincent to force him to make a move. But Caleb couldn't do it alone. He needed eyes on the ground, people who could get close to Michael and his associates without drawing attention. That's where Marcus came in. Caleb had reached out to him again, asking if he could dig deeper into the network of associates tied to Vincent and Michael Harrington. Marcus was a whiz with digital forensics, and Caleb hoped that his skills would give them an edge. A few days later, Marcus came through with a crucial lead. He had hacked into an encrypted email chain, one that Caleb hadn't been able to access. The emails revealed a meeting between Michael Harrington and a group of enforcers, men like Jack, Tom, and Mike. They were discussing their next steps in the operation, the next target, the next store to be pressured, and the next round of intimidation tactics. And buried in one of the emails was a reference to the community center that Caleb had grown up near. The center had been a cornerstone of the neighborhood for decades, providing support to families, offering after-school programs, and serving as a safe space for kids. If the Harringtons were targeting the community center, it meant they were pushing beyond small businesses. They were going after everything that kept the community intact. This was the break Caleb had been waiting for. He wasted no time in contacting Rachel. She listened to the details of Marcus's findings with growing concern. "This is big," Rachel said, her voice serious. "The community center is a linchpin. If they get their hands on it, the whole neighborhood could collapse. We've got to move fast before they can execute their plans." Caleb nodded. He had always known that the stakes were high, but this confirmed everything. It wasn't just his store at risk, it was the heart of the community, and Caleb wasn't about to let it fall into the hands of a developer who only saw dollar signs. "We need to make a move before they do," Caleb said, his voice low with determination. "If they're planning to make a move on the community center, we can't wait for them to strike first. We need to get the proof we need, and we need to do it now." Rachel agreed, and the plan started to take shape. Caleb would have to confront Michael and his crew directly. He couldn't wait for the police to move in. The timing had to be perfect. He needed the element of surprise, and he needed to catch Michael and his associates in the act. The next step was getting surveillance footage from the community center. Caleb knew that it would be heavily guarded, but he had a contact, a friend who worked as a security guard at the center. He was the kind of guy who would risk his job to help a friend, and Caleb was hoping that he would be able to sneak him a copy of the surveillance footage from the night Michael and his men were planning their attack. If they had evidence of the plan, they could bring it to the authorities and make the case against Harrington. While waiting for the footage, Caleb continued his preparations. He checked the security systems in his store again, making sure everything was locked down. He couldn't afford to take any chances. If Jack and his crew were planning another confrontation, Caleb wanted to be ready. As the days passed, the tension mounted. Caleb felt the weight of everything on his shoulders, the pressure to protect his store, his community, and the people he cared about. But he knew that the time for waiting was over. It was time to act. The days were starting to blur together. Caleb had become used to the tension that hung in the air, a constant hum that reverberated through every moment of his waking hours. The preparations had reached a boiling point. He could feel the storm coming, and it would either break him or make him stronger. The stakes had never been higher, not just for him, but for his community, the people who depended on him. The footage from the community center had finally arrived. Caleb's friend, the security guard, had risked his job to sneak the footage out, and it was everything Caleb had hoped for. The night was clear in the video, the small team of men, including Michael Harrington, planning the next phase of their takeover. The blueprint for the community center was clearly visible on the table, with a list of names and addresses scribbled across it. They were going to force the staff out, scare off the local families, and then move in. Their plan was simple: create chaos, force the sale, and replace the community center with high-end condos. The footage was the smoking gun Caleb needed, and he knew it. But there was no time to sit on it. If they didn't act quickly, the community center could be gone by the end of the week. The risk of letting them go any further was too great. Caleb could already imagine the ripple effect it would cause, a domino effect that would take down the remaining small businesses and strip away the heart of his neighborhood. His store wouldn't be far behind. Caleb met with Rachel again, their usual meeting spot now a dim corner booth at a local diner. He slid the flash drive with the footage across the table toward her. This is it. Michael's crew is planning to hit the community center tonight. If we don't stop them now, it's over. Rachel's eyes scanned the files on the flash drive, her fingers skimming over the evidence, the undeniable proof that Harrington's operation was more organized and more dangerous than they had ever realized. We've got them now, she said, her voice firm. We'll get a warrant, but we need to move faster. We can't risk them slipping away. Caleb nodded. He had already made up his mind. I'm not waiting for them to make the first move. I'll go in tonight, get the rest of the evidence, and confront them. I can't let them get away with it. Rachel's face tightened. Caleb, this isn't your fight alone. You've already been through too much. We can't afford to take this lightly. If you confront them directly, it could blow the whole case. But Caleb wasn't listening. He knew the risks, and he knew the stakes. He had spent too many sleepless nights watching his back, listening to the whispers of intimidation and threats, wondering if today was the day they'd come for him. He wasn't going to wait around anymore. He was going to stop them. Tonight. I'm going to make sure this ends tonight, Caleb said, his voice quiet but resolute. This neighborhood needs to see that they can fight back, that we won't let people like Harrington just walk in and destroy everything. Rachel sighed, clearly torn, but she knew there was no changing Caleb's mind. All right, she said after a long pause, but I'm with you on this. I'll have officers on standby in case things go south. Caleb left the diner feeling the weight of the decision heavy on his shoulders. He knew Rachel had a point. This wasn't something he could do alone, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized just how deep the corruption ran. The evidence they had collected was damning, but it wasn't enough. They needed to catch Michael in the act, and Caleb knew that tonight was their only chance. The rest of the day was a blur of preparation. Caleb worked his store, greeted customers, and kept an eye on the street outside. But every now and then, his mind would drift back to the mission at hand. He wasn't going to let them hurt his community. He had already given up too much to let it go. By late afternoon, Caleb received a call from Marcus, who had managed to dig up some more information. Michael Harrington was meeting with another group of enforcers at a rundown factory on the outskirts of town. Caleb couldn't afford to wait for more backup. He knew this was it. They were closing in. He quickly left the store, locking up behind him. He had a final meeting with Rachel, and then he would head to the factory. The moment of truth was fast approaching. Rachel met him outside the station, a look of concern in her eyes. "You're sure about this?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with concern. "I've made up my mind," Caleb replied, determination thick in his tone. "If I don't do this now, we'll lose everything. I can't let that happen." Rachel's eyes lingered on him for a moment, but then she nodded. "Then let's do this. I'll be right behind you." Caleb nodded in return, feeling the weight of her support. Together, they climbed into the car, and Caleb gave the address to the officer who would be on standby. The ride to the factory felt longer than it was. The factory loomed in the distance, dark and imposing, its windows cracked and dirty. It was the perfect place for something sinister to happen, and Caleb had no doubt that tonight would be the night everything would change. As they pulled up to the factory, Caleb's heart was racing. He didn't know what he would face when he stepped inside, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't back down. The fate of the community was in his hands now, and he wasn't going to let anyone stand in the way. Rachel pulled the car to a stop a few blocks away, and Caleb exited the vehicle, his senses on high alert. He moved toward the factory, his steps quiet and deliberate, every nerve in his body tuned to the danger that lay ahead. He could hear the muffled voices of the men inside as he neared the building. He ducked behind a stack of crates, staying low, and peered inside through a crack in the wall. Michael Harrington and his crew were gathered around a table, blueprint of the community center spread out before them. Caleb's pulse quickened. This was it. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. But he couldn't rush in. He had to stay focused. He needed the evidence, the undeniable proof that would finally bring them down. Caleb crouched behind the crates, barely breathing, as he watched Michael Harrington and his men gather around the table. The blueprint of the community center was spread out before them, marked with red circles around key areas. They were already making plans to disrupt the center's operations, targeting vulnerable sections of the building where families gathered and children played. The images made Caleb's blood boil. This wasn't just a business deal. It was an attack on everything the neighborhood stood for. His fingers tightened around the grip of his baton, and his mind raced through the options. He could rush in, take them by surprise, and confront them directly. But that would risk everything. He needed more than just a confrontation. He needed undeniable evidence that would tie Harrington directly to the violence, something that would make it impossible for him to slip away. Caleb watched as Michael leaned forward, speaking to one of the men at the table, a thug with a scar across his cheek. "We move in tomorrow night," Michael said, his voice low but laced with confidence. "Make sure the staff's gone by then. We'll take control. This place will be ours just like the rest of them." The thug nodded, a wicked smile on his face. "You think the owners will cave as easily as the rest of them?" he asked. "They won't have a choice," Michael replied coldly. "Once we break their will, they'll sell, just like everyone else. And if they don't, we'll make it too expensive for them to stay." He glanced down at the blueprint, tracing a line across the page. "I want this place turned into luxury condos. The neighborhood's ripe for the picking. We start with the community center, then we'll get the rest of the block." Caleb's jaw tightened. He had heard enough. This was the moment. He had to act. He glanced toward the door, the only exit visible from where he crouched. His heart pounded in his chest as he weighed his options. He couldn't let them get away with this. He couldn't let Michael go unchallenged again. Before he could make a move, a faint sound broke through the silence. The rustling of footsteps. Caleb froze. His instincts screamed at him to stay still, and for a moment, he did nothing but wait. Slowly, he turned his head, eyes scanning the area around him. One of Michael's men was heading toward the door. Caleb didn't have much time. He waited until the man was just a few feet away from him, then moved like a shadow, slipping from behind the crates and taking advantage of the man's distraction. With a swift motion, Caleb grabbed the thug by the wrist, twisting it behind his back and pulling him into the shadows. The man grunted in surprise, but Caleb was too fast. He pressed a knee into the thug's back, pinning him to the ground. "Stay quiet," Caleb whispered, his voice cold and controlled. "You're not going anywhere." The man struggled briefly, but Caleb's hold was firm. He kept his eyes on the group inside the room, noting how Michael was still talking, unaware of the danger creeping closer. Caleb quickly tied the man's hands behind his back using some spare rope he had in his pack, then crouched down, scanning the factory floor for the next move. His heart was still racing, but now was not the time to let his nerves get the best of him. He had the upper hand for now, and he couldn't afford to lose it. Caleb knew exactly what he needed to do. Get inside, get the rest of the evidence, and make sure Michael and his crew couldn't escape. He had to strike hard and fast, no mistakes. After securing the thug, Caleb moved silently toward the entrance to the main area, where Michael and the others were gathered. He had seen a window near the back of the factory earlier, and it was his best bet for getting close without alerting the rest of the crew. With one last glance at the subdued man, Caleb crept to the window, gently lifting the old rusted latch. The window opened with a soft squeak, but Caleb had already slipped inside before the sound could be noticed. Now inside, Caleb took a moment to collect himself. The place was dimly lit, but it was enough for him to make out the figures sitting around the table. He could hear their low voices, talking about their next steps, but it was clear they were focused on the blueprint in front of them. This was his chance. Caleb moved closer, staying in the shadows as he crept along the edge of the room. His heart was still pounding, but now he had a singular focus. He needed to record every word, every action, so there was no doubt that Michael and his crew were responsible for everything. He had to catch them in the act. His phone was in his hand, the recording app activated, and as he approached the table, Caleb could hear Michael's voice rise slightly, a hint of impatience creeping in. "We don't have time to waste," Michael said, his tone sharp, If we don't move fast, we'll lose the edge. We're taking over this block, and we're not stopping until we've got every last piece of property under control. This neighborhood belongs to us, understand? One of the other men, a heavy-set enforcer, nodded. Got it? No mercy. We make sure the center's gone by tomorrow. Caleb's finger hovered over his phone. He had the evidence he needed. But there was something about the way Michael spoke, the finality in his voice, that made Caleb hesitate. He knew this wasn't just about a few buildings. It was about something bigger, something deeper. If he could take down Harrington's entire operation, the damage to the community might be halted before it spiraled completely out of control. It was a risk, but Caleb had come this far. He wasn't going to stop now. Suddenly, Caleb heard a sound behind him, a faint shuffle of footsteps, the flicker of light in the corner of his eye. Someone had heard him. With no time to think, Caleb ducked behind a stack of crates, his heart racing. He could hear the men shifting, getting up from the table. Michael's voice cut through the tension. Who's there? Caleb had only a split second to decide. His body moved on instinct, and he surged forward, using the cover of darkness to his advantage. He grabbed one of the men by the throat, pulling him into the shadows and choking off the sound of his protests. The rest of the crew was still on alert, but Caleb's training kicked in. He was fast, calculated, and ruthless when necessary. The room erupted into confusion as Caleb disabled two more men, knocking them out cold before they could react. Michael's voice rang out, demanding answers, but Caleb was already moving, trying to keep ahead of the chaos. He needed to finish this. He had the evidence. He had the proof. It was now or never. Caleb's heart pounded in his chest, but his movements were precise, his focus unshaken. The room had exploded into chaos as he swiftly neutralized two of Michael's men. The element of surprise had been on his side, but it wouldn't last. Michael and the others were now fully aware of the intruder in their midst. For a brief moment, Caleb froze. He could hear Michael barking orders, his voice cutting through the air, thick with frustration. Find him! I don't care who it is! Get him! But Caleb was already moving again, slipping deeper into the shadows of the factory, his mind sharp as a razor. His goal was clear: get the evidence, get Michael, and take down Harrington's operation once and for all. The factory was dark and vast, filled with cluttered machinery and piles of scrap metal. It was the perfect place for a confrontation like this. Its winding pathways and hidden corners would make it harder for the crew to find him. Caleb knew that Michael was smart, and they would search every inch of the building if they had to. But Caleb had the advantage. He had the upper hand in terms of stealth, and he was playing for keeps. As he crouched behind a stack of old pallets, Caleb's phone vibrated in his pocket. It was a message from Rachel. We've got a warrant. We're on our way. He didn't have much time left. The noise from the other side of the factory grew louder, the footsteps and shouts of Michael's men becoming more frantic. Caleb knew that if he didn't make his move now, he would be cornered. But it wasn't just about getting out alive. It was about stopping Michael and the rest of them from ever causing this kind of destruction again. Caleb had seen the impact of their actions. He had seen the way the neighborhood was being slowly suffocated, its heart and soul ripped out in the name of profit. He couldn't allow that to happen. Taking a deep breath, Caleb moved swiftly to the central part of the factory. The blueprints of the community center were still on the table, lying there like a roadmap to everything Michael had planned. It was now or never. Caleb quickly snapped a few pictures of the blueprint with his phone, his fingers flying over the screen. He needed concrete proof of their plans, something that could be used in court, something that could bring down the entire operation. Then a voice broke through the noise. Looking for something? Caleb's stomach clenched. He turned slowly, his body going rigid, to find Michael standing at the edge of the factory floor, a smug smile playing on his lips. He had been watching Caleb the entire time. I knew it wouldn't be that easy, Michael said, his voice dripping with venom. You think you can just waltz in here and take everything I've worked for? You think this ends with you walking out of here with a few pictures? You don't know who you're dealing with. Caleb's eyes locked onto Michael's, his grip tightening on his baton. This ends now, Michael, he said evenly, his voice low but unwavering. Your little empire is falling apart, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. Michael's face twisted with rage. You're a fool if you think you're the one calling the shots here. You think you've won, but you've only scratched the surface. You don't know what kind of power I have." Caleb's eyes narrowed. "I know enough to bring you down." Suddenly, Michael stepped forward, pulling a gun from his belt. The metallic click of the safety being switched off echoed through the factory. Caleb's breath caught in his throat, but he didn't hesitate. His military training kicked in, his instincts guiding him through the danger. Without warning, Caleb lunged forward, closing the gap between him and Michael in a split second. Michael fired, but Caleb was already ducking, using the nearby machinery as cover. The bullet ricocheted off the steel, and Caleb's fist connected with Michael's chest, knocking him back. "You think this is over?" Michael gasped, struggling to get to his feet. His grip on the gun was unsteady now. "You're dead, Caleb. You and your little crusade. We have connections you can't even imagine. People who—" Caleb didn't let him finish. With a swift motion, he disarmed Michael, sending the gun clattering across the factory floor. Caleb held him at bay, his face inches from Michael's, eyes burning with determination. "You're finished," he said quietly, his voice like ice. "Your crew's done. Your brother's done. You're going to pay for what you've done." Just as Caleb moved to cuff Michael, the sound of sirens blared in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Caleb knew Rachel and the backup had arrived. The cavalry was here. Michael's eyes flicked toward the door, and for a moment, Caleb thought he might try to run. But it was too late. The police flooded in, their guns drawn, as they swarmed the factory floor. Caleb stepped aside, allowing the officers to take Michael into custody. Rachel entered behind the officers, her expression tense but relieved. "Nice work, Caleb," she said, offering him a brief smile. "We've got him." Caleb didn't smile back. His thoughts were already racing ahead. Michael was only one piece of the puzzle. They still had to deal with Vincent Harrington, the mastermind behind everything. But this was a huge win. With Michael in custody and the evidence secured, they were one step closer to taking down the entire operation. As Michael was escorted out of the factory, his face twisted with hatred, Caleb stood still, watching him go. The victory felt hollow. The real fight was far from over, and there was still more to do. But for the first time in a long time, Caleb felt like they were on the right track. He turned to Rachel, his gaze hard. "This isn't over. We need to move on Harrington now." Rachel nodded, her expression serious. "We will. But for now, you did good. We've got a shot at ending this. Once we get the charges on Michael, we go after Vincent." Caleb nodded. He wasn't done yet. He wouldn't stop until he had seen this through. The neighborhood had been under siege for too long. It was time to fight back, and Caleb wasn't about to back down now. The day after the operation at the factory, Caleb walked into Turner's Market with a renewed sense of purpose. The store was still a mess, empty shelves and broken glass scattered across the floor, but the atmosphere had changed. For the first time in weeks, Caleb felt a flicker of hope. The storm that had been threatening for so long was finally starting to break. Michael Harrington was in custody, and the charges against him were stacking up. The evidence was undeniable. The footage from the community center, the documents showing how his crew had systematically targeted businesses like Caleb's, and the testimony from the men who had worked for him. It was all coming together. But the real battle was just beginning. With Michael arrested and his operation crumbling, the next target was Vincent Harrington, the mastermind behind it all. Caleb knew it wouldn't be easy. Vincent was a powerful man, and he had connections that reached far beyond the city. But Caleb also knew that the truth was on his side. The community was behind him, and with the evidence they had gathered, Vincent wouldn't be able to escape justice forever. As Caleb wiped down the counter, his mind raced through the next steps. Rachel had promised him they would move on Vincent quickly, but he had learned long ago not to rely on anyone else for his safety or the safety of the people in his neighborhood. He needed to be ready for whatever came next. Just as he was about to head into the back room to grab more supplies, the bell above the door jingled. Caleb looked up and saw Detective Rachel Brooks walk in. She was holding a file in her hands, her face unreadable. "We got him," Rachel said without preamble, sliding the file across the counter. "Vincent Harrington is officially under investigation, and the DA is already working on charges. We've got enough evidence to put him away for a long time." Caleb allowed himself a brief moment of relief, but it didn't last. He knew how quickly things could turn. Vincent wouldn't go down without a fight. "Do we have enough to make sure he doesn't get away with it?" Caleb asked, his voice steady but firm. Rachel nodded. "We do. His brother's testimony, Michael's confession, the records we've gathered from the factory. He's got no way to talk his way out of this. But it's going to take time. Vincent's connected, and he has a lot of resources. We'll need to be careful, and we need to keep the pressure on." Caleb stood tall, his resolve hardening. "I'm not backing down, not until it's done. You've got all the support you need from me and the community." Rachel smiled faintly. "I know, and that's why we're going to win this, together." Over the next few weeks, the case against Vincent Harrington continued to build. Rachel and Caleb worked tirelessly, gathering additional evidence and securing testimonies from more of the people who had been affected by Harrington's schemes. It wasn't just about Caleb's store anymore. It was about the entire neighborhood, the families who had lived here for generations, and the community that had fought to survive against forces determined to tear it apart. Then one cold morning, the call came. Caleb had just opened the store when Rachel called him with the news. "We've got the warrant," she said, her voice low but full of authority. "We're going in. Vincent Harrington is going to be arrested today." Caleb's heart raced. This was it, the final showdown. He had fought for this moment for so long, and now it was finally within reach. Caleb locked the front door of the store, the familiar creak of the door echoing through the empty aisles. As he stepped into the back office, he grabbed the file on his desk, filled with everything they had learned about Vincent's operation. The evidence was overwhelming. There was no way he was going to escape justice now. The sirens outside told him that Rachel's team was already in motion. The raid on Vincent's office complex would be swift, but Caleb knew that Vincent's people would be ready to fight back. They had already tried to intimidate him and his crew, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. Caleb met Rachel outside the store, the two of them standing in the parking lot as the unmarked police vehicles rolled up. Officers poured out, their faces grim and focused. They had prepared for this day for weeks, and Caleb knew they were ready. Vincent Harrington's office was a sleek, modern building in the heart of the city, towering over the surrounding neighborhood like a monument to his greed. Caleb had driven past it countless times, wondering how many people's lives had been ruined to put it there. Today, that monument would come crashing down. The convoy pulled to a stop in front of the building, and Caleb's eyes narrowed as he watched the officers move into position. Rachel was already in motion, coordinating the team and ensuring that every exit was covered. Caleb followed her into the building, his heart pounding with anticipation. They moved quickly through the sleek, glass-lined lobby. Vincent's receptionist froze when she saw the police entering. The moment Rachel flashed her badge, the woman's face went pale, and she stammered out the location of Vincent's office. Up on the top floor, they found him. Vincent Harrington sat behind a massive desk, looking as calm and collected as ever. He didn't even flinch when the officers barged into the room, guns drawn. "Detective Brooks," Vincent said smoothly, standing up as if he were expecting this moment. "I assume you have a warrant?" Rachel didn't answer. She didn't need to. The team moved in, cuffing him quickly and efficiently. Caleb stood back, watching as Vincent was led out of the office in silence. His once imposing figure seemed diminished now, the power he had held over the community stripped away in an instant. As Vincent was taken into the elevator, Caleb's gaze met Rachel's. There was a brief moment of shared understanding. They had done it. They had brought him down. The trial wasn't easy. Vincent's lawyers did everything they could to discredit the evidence, to paint Caleb and the others as vigilantes or worse. But the truth was undeniable. The evidence, the testimonies, and the relentless pursuit of justice were all in their favor. One by one, the pieces of Vincent Harrington's empire began to crumble. Weeks later, the verdict came down. Vincent Harrington was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. The damage he had done to the community was immeasurable, but at least now, the people he had tried to crush had a chance to rebuild. Caleb stood in Turner's Market as the first rays of sunlight broke through the windows. The store was still a work in progress, the scars of the violence and intimidation still visible, but it was standing, and so was the community. As the people began to trickle back into the store, Caleb looked around, taking in the familiar faces of his neighbors. They had been through hell, but they were still here, and together they would rebuild. Still standing, Caleb muttered to himself, a small smile tugging at his lips. He wasn't done yet. The fight for his community wasn't over, but for now the war had been won.